Welcome to the Happier Life Project, the official podcast from the award-winning mental health and wellness app, My Possible Self. Hosted by broadcaster and journalist Gabby Sanderson.
Hello and welcome to an even more sensitive and delicate episode of the Happier Life Project than usual. We're talking exclusively today about consent, particularly, although not explicitly, sexual consent. So I do just want to start off by saying please do proceed carefully and with caution. This episode contains sensitive discussions around sexual consent, boundary violations, and experiences that some of you may find a bit difficult to listen to or perhaps triggering. So please do take care if proceeding and whilst listening. Now, when we look at consent, often it might be thought of as a simple yes or no. But in reality, it can be far more nuanced. And that complexity is exactly why misunderstandings can arise. And it's why I wanted to record an episode exploring boundaries, communication, and those difficult grey areas, which, in fact, according to today's guest, aren't actually so grey after all. I'm joined by Dr. Nina Burrowes, psychologist, author, activist, and founder of the Consent Collective and Safe Workplace Culture. Nina has spent years studying the psychology of sexual violence and relationship abuse, working with both offenders and survivors, and helping organisations and communities build safer, more respectful cultures. Nina is a trusted voice in this space, bringing a grounded sense of calm that comes from years of navigating this complex terrain with a huge variety of groups, from universities to offices and beyond. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to start off by looking at why misunderstandings around consent are still so common, from the pressures young people face at university to the way desire, people-pleasing, and uncertainty shape new relationships. With the festive season upon us, we also explore how alcohol, office parties, and blurred social settings can distort boundaries and complicate communication. Nina helps us to unpack what to do when we see or experience inappropriate behaviour in our workplace environments. We talk about why harassment still, even now, persists, and what it really means to stay connected to ourselves when situations feel murky or uncomfortable. Ultimately, this conversation is about learning the skill of consent, recognising our own signals, communicating with confidence, looking out for others in vulnerable situations, and creating environments where people feel safe, respected, and empowered. So whether you're navigating dating, university life, the upcoming festive season, or perhaps still carrying the weight of regret from past situations, this episode offers clear, compassionate guidance on honouring your boundaries and supporting others in doing the same. So, if I have your consent, let's begin the show. Well, welcome, Dr. Nina Burrowes, to the Happier Life Project podcast. What we're talking about today is consent and the grey area, and your background, I mean, you're really deep in the trenches from what I can understand in terms of who you work with, who you've worked with, you know, perpetrators and victims. And I suppose what we're discussing today, I really wanted to get something out amongst this festive period that we're gearing up to, where there's a lot more drinking, certainly in the UK at least, that goes on around office parties and, you know, festivities, let's just say. And so consent and the grey area, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
I think off the get-go, can we kind of clarify what we mean by consent?
You know what I've found, I've been talking about consent for, I think, nearly 20 years now. And what I've found is a lot of people misunderstand it. I think when we have these conversations, I think what we think it's going to be is like this quite moralistic, be a good person, don't cause harm. And we see consent as this, if you're a good person, you'll be consensual. And if you're a bad person, you won't be. And actually, the truth of consent is it's a skill. So let's immediately understand that this isn't a moralistic thing. This is about how skillful are you in your interactions with other people. And it's a good news skill. Like, consent is something to celebrate. It's not there to make things less fun. It's not there to be frightened of. Like, we are all beautifully different, which means we all want and enjoy different things. We need a skill to be able to navigate all of that, and consent is the skill that we've got. So really, we can start to be thinking about and get curious about, how skillful am I with different people in different situations, in different ways, with different behaviors when it comes to consent, because we're constantly navigating other people. There is always difference. There is always power. So yeah, where are the areas where you're really good at that? When does it slip? How can you learn about yourself and get curious?
A lot of people that will be listening are young people around the university age. You work with a lot of universities. Do you think the generation now is more knowledgeable and unafraid when it comes to consent and boundaries? Because we're more used to maybe the language, we're more open about mental health than we were in the past, or is it still something that people are struggling with?
I think we've got generations now that are growing up, and as they've grown up, the conversation has moved on. So whereas when I was younger, this was not something I was ever encouraged to think about, talk about, have conversations with other people about. It's possible that younger generations, they're having a different experience, but what they're getting often is the knowledge. But I've already framed this as it's a skill. And so they still need to go on the same journey as every other generation of becoming skillful at this. Do I think this is a generation that are more skillful? No, like every skill, you have to learn, you have to practice. Part of the skill set is communication. It involves navigating difference, and sometimes that means conflict, but that doesn't always mean abuse. That just means difference and power coming together in a way where you need to be skillful to navigate that together. And that's something we could all get better at. It's not just about having the information, it's applying it.
Is there too much assumed consent that happens?
I would say, let's recognize that some people mean to cause harm. That's a small category of people, like they're looking to cause harm. But a huge category of people are going out and they are causing harm without intending to do so. And I think that's the bit where we can understand this is a skill. You are not skillful at consent in that moment in time. And I think as a society and as individuals, this is a particular category of harm that is avoidable. Like, literally nobody wants it to happen. So it's kind of devastating all round when it does happen. And so a lot of our work is going into university spaces and workplaces and talking to people about this skill, and also about giving and receiving feedback when people get it wrong. And I think we need to understand that is not about policing other people and calling out things we don't like. It's actually being skillful enough to give people the feedback that they really need, because without that feedback, you can't learn about yourself. And so we need friends who are courageous enough and generous enough and care about us enough to pull us aside and say, hey, you know that thing that you just did? This is how it made me feel. And I trust that you would want to know that those are the conversations we need to be having with the people we care about.
Could you talk a little bit more about your work with the universities? And I think I don't want to totally generalise, but I think if you're at university, it's festive season all year round. There's a lot of partying that goes on. So
and there should be, and
Yeah, absolutely. I had an absolute blast. But you're still figuring things out. And I think there is still that sort of herd mentality, maybe that continues from high school and college. You want to fit in, you want to follow what your friends are doing. And this is where, if we talk about sexual consent, then we are getting into this grey area where, you know, you might like somebody, you know, you might fancy them, you might have started exploring some kind of romantic relationship. But then there's this enthusiastic consent, and then there's this sort of just going along with it. And I think this is then where we can look at also how that affects our mental health. What have you seen and sort of shared in the university space in this area?
Yeah, I think with universities, you've got this situation where people have suddenly got the most freedom perhaps they've ever had, away from home for the first time, socializing that maybe or maybe doesn't involve alcohol and drugs and things like that. And you're navigating all of that. And like, I think that is all a good thing. Like, this is all about, you know, growing and learning and becoming the adult that you're growing into. So that's like all great. I think when it comes to consent, it's just about having, for yourself, it's about knowing what you do and do not want and where that's coming from, like your own consent. I think it's really important to understand, what do I want? What do I like? When it comes to sexual pleasure, to have some, you know, some curiosity around that for yourself. And then the courage to ask for that, to negotiate that with other people, to be really clear on when what is happening is not what you're into. And so I think the skill of communication around sex, the more we can be skillful around communication, the more consensual our encounters are going to be. And it's really important to understand that consent is the gateway to pleasure. Like, that is what it is about. It's about understanding each other so that you have the most positive experience, whether what you're doing is sexual or not. The whole point is, let's have the most fun. But you can only do that if we all understand what everybody here thinks is fun. And when those things align, you're going to have a great time. And it's about having the skills and the confidence to negotiate that and communicate that when that's not going right, with an understanding that we all deserve to be with people who are totally into us. And so it's generous to let someone know when that's not happening.
Mistakes happen, especially when you're younger. Well, you don't have to be at university. You could also be anywhere, anytime, couldn't it?
You're 50s and be getting this wrong, don't worry.
Exactly. Well, yeah. And so what about, I guess what I'm getting to is, the next day you regret your actions of the night before. Maybe it is because you were under the influence of alcohol. How do you sort of navigate those quite unpleasant feelings the next day? Maybe you feel a bit dirty, maybe you feel a bit violated, because in the cold light of day, it isn't something that you would have consciously chosen.
Yeah, I think with care and without wanting to fill in the gaps to say, oh, that's what this story is in either direction. If that's where somebody was at, I think it's, you know, curiosity is such a gift. So cool, let's get curious. Exactly how are you feeling at the time during that incident? Because, you know, is this a situation where actually you made a bad choice for yourself and that isn't the kind of person you're into, and you're like not feeling good about that? And in which case this is all lessons. You know, what could you have done differently? Or is it in truth in the moment that you were feeling afraid and you were feeling closed down because you didn't feel that you were able to do or say anything to stop what was happening? And they're two quite different situations. And I guess it's about being curious. I don't think we always want to like jump too quickly, but you might have an underwriting sense. And I would say mostly it's your body that's going to know how literally I'm curious about your body in that moment. How was it feeling? Because, you know, sex can be so many things, but what it shouldn't be is frightening. Yeah. But what it can be sometimes is, you know, you can end up having sex and you think, actually, I do wish I hadn't slept with that person, but that doesn't mean that what happened wasn't consensual. It's like you didn't make an awesome choice for yourself that night. So I get curious about that and find people that you can talk with about it. If this is in an ongoing relationship, I'd be curious about whether you felt you could talk about it with your sexual partner. Because if you felt that this isn't something you could talk about, then that's more information. Okay, this isn't somebody you necessarily feel safe with to have that kind of conversation. I treat it with care.
Can you explain, let's talk a bit more about the grey area then. Where do things get confusing or unclear, would you say? Is it when things are heating up in the moment?
You know, I'm not so sure there are loads of grey areas. I actually think if we're saying it's a grey area, it might be something we're just not communicating very clearly. Because if in that moment of grey area, somebody was to say something to the other person, it would suddenly all get a whole lot clearer. Unless the conversation, if there's a grey area, I think it might be, I don't know what I really want for myself. And your own journey with your sexual self, that can be, I don't know if I would like that. But then you could have a conversation about, well, would you like to try it now? And, how will we do this in a way that feels safe? Or is it something to talk about doing later? So I think that bit there, your own pleasure, that's something that you can discover and unfold and invest in, all those things in the right circumstances. But when it comes to where you interact with another person, if it's feeling a bit grey, somebody needs to say something, ask a question. Hey, are you still into this? Or, hey, I'm not 100% sure that this is what I want. Can we stop for a minute and do something else?
So could it get more grey the next day if one person has one experience where it felt very consensual and pleasurable, but then the other person is feeling shame and regret? Do you see that happen or is that the easy option for the person that said, well, I thought it was consensual kind of thing, like almost a bit flippant?
Yeah, I think this is where a lot of people do trip up, because we are all the world leading expert on our own consent. Like what we are and are not happy with, what we want. We're literally the person on the planet who knows that the most. So we get to own that. When it comes to what other people are consenting to, we don't know. We're not mind readers. We can't tell. We're going to have to communicate. So there's always going to be were you therefore, just because you are okay with what's happening and just because you are having a wonderful time, that doesn't mean the other person was. So what made you think that they were consenting? What were they saying? What were you asking them? What were you communicating with them at the time? What were they actively doing? And I think what far too many people do, the biggest mistake is, well, they didn't stop me and they didn't say no, so it must have been okay. And that is so unsafe and so unskilled at consent, because it completely misses the point that there is power in all of this, and people don't always feel safe, or maybe it's not about safety. They feel too embarrassed to say, I'm not really into this, or you're not very good at this, or I'm not having fun now. And that can then escalate to, you're not noticing that I'm into this. You're not noticing that I've stopped actively participating in this. And so now I'm afraid. So if you're the active party in that situation, it's really important that you know that they didn't say no or they didn't stop me. That does not mean that they were consenting. Worst case scenario, that could mean that they are at this point afraid of you and afraid of what's happening. And nobody wants that, apart from the people who mean to cause harm.
Yeah, well, this leads me quite nicely into when I was listening to you on a different podcast talking about not living in our bodies. And I guess when you're talking about being aware of yourself and your feelings, but also the other person and their experience of you coming together in a very intimate way. Can you talk to me about this not living in our bodies, what you mean by that?
Well, certainly on the part of the person who potentially at this point is experiencing something non-consensual, like something that they don't want, one of the kind of survival responses to that can be like dissociation. Which I think is like really clever. Like you don't feel like you can physically escape what's happening to you. So you kind of mentally escape what's happening to you. You're kind of not in your body anymore. You're kind of observing yourself. It can be psychologically protective to do that. But the experience you can have in the moment of one where like, yeah, I was like I was watching myself, or I didn't really feel fully there. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't. I wanted to do something, but I couldn't. You know, it's quite a numbing experience. But that's a survival mechanism kicking in. That is coming because your system has detected threat. So that, I mean, and you know, this is the bit where we have lost consent. You know, our systems don't detect threat if we're having a great time. They detect threat when we experience fear. So the minute we're having those kinds of experiences, like consent left, it's no longer with us. It can also be for people who do mean to cause harm. There can be an element of dissociation there too. Like it can be like the whole thing can be arousing and from psychologically quite damaged places if you're somebody who's meaning to cause harm. And again, it can have this kind of this element to it as well.
Going back to, again, festive season as we're kind of wrapping things up, like what advice would you have to anybody listening now just to keep themselves safe? Not, again, like as you've also stressed, not to not enjoy yourself and have a great time, but just, you know, especially because alcohol can, what's right, we could blur everything.
Yeah, alcohol makes this worse. Like, but basically, whatever environment you're in, if people are drinking, the risk just went up because it lowers our inhibitions, which means we do things we would not normally do, and it also means we misinterpret situations. And so that's why there's a relationship between the two. And this could be university, this could be workplace Christmas party. And kind of the same, you see the same patterns. It's almost like workplace Christmas parties are the equivalent of welcome week for universities. It's just this high risk environment. Yeah, and it is. And there's a lot going on in those environments. And I think we all have work to do here. For some of us, although I'd invite all of us to do this, it's to reflect on ourselves and how consensual we're being in the moment, to understand that if you're a work colleague with someone, you're really quite hard to avoid because they have to work with you. You know, if a social situation, they might tell you to get lost and they can avoid you for the rest of their lives. If you work with them, that might not feel very professional and they can't avoid you because you work together. So just understand that people have got less avenues for ignoring you. They kind of might feel obliged to be polite and put up with your presence. Whereas in other situations, they wouldn't. So to have that sensitivity, to always be looking for the no, to be creating situations where people are free to kind of opt into you if they're interested rather than having to find ways to get away from you. So we can all be curious about that.
Yeah.
We can be curious about how much we're drinking, what we like with alcohol. Are we worse? Maybe we shouldn't be a drinker because it's not good news for everybody. We can be looking out for our friends. And I mean that in multiple ways. I mean that in that notice if your friend isn't noticing a no, and have a chat with them and encourage them. Maybe they've had too much to drink. Like, look, if you really care about these people, then you'll be watching their behaviour in multiple ways. And you know what? One day it might be you that's had too much to drink and needs to be put in a taxi home because you're being a pain to others. So, look out for our friends. But also for ourselves, it's just to have the courage to, I would hope that we can try to find ways to look after ourselves in terms of our boundaries and stuff. That's not always possible in these situations. And I think there's a balancing act when you've got a job like mine, because you always want to be like, of course, in these situations, power is used. So, people aren't expected to be able to protect themselves. But at the same time, we're told we're afraid of embarrassing other people by saying no or being a bit honest about what we think of them. And I don't know, maybe be honest. Maybe be kindly honest to people if they're giving you attention that's unwelcome, because that's the message they need to hear.
It is actually very difficult if it's like somebody at work that's maybe a senior colleague or your boss, and they could be being appropriate, but like it could be batted away as banter, but it could be over sexualized comments or touches,
And I think when people...
What do we do there? Because there's the fear of getting fired.
Yeah, they can. Yeah, exactly. And it depends what kind of organization you're working for. Like, you'll know the culture. Some organizations, you'll know you'd be totally supported by the organization. You could go to someone else senior, no problem. Other organizations, maybe not so good. I guess always in these situations, like, you find an ally, find a colleague, find somebody. So you're not, what am I going to do? But what are we going to do about this? Somebody you can talk to about it. And I think, it is harder if there's a power dynamic at play. But at the end of the day, this needs to stop and you need to be safe. That's like number one. And then number two is this person needs some feedback about their behavior. So who is best? It doesn't always have to be you that does that, but somebody needs to give them some feedback. Somebody ideally with the same level of power as they have. So somebody else who's also senior. Like, that's the places where we work and they're doing this work well. The senior teams understand that they, as a senior team, need to be doing that with each other because they have more power than anyone else in the organization.
Well, let's signpost then to your two organisations, just as we are wrapping things up. It's a Consent Collective is one of them, and the other one is Safe Workplace Culture. We'll put all the links in the episode show notes as well. Is there anything that you specifically want to say about both of these organisations for people that are listening right now and perhaps this is hitting home or hitting a nerve?
I think if you are curious for yourself, we've got some support resources that you're going to find on the Consent Collective website. There's a book of mine called The Courage to Be Me, which is for people who've had these kinds of experiences and they're on that kind of healing path. If you're working somewhere or studying somewhere and you think they could be better at preventing this and better at raising these kinds of conversations, then let them know about us. We're working with universities, we're working with employers. We do this, because we're passionate about it, and we're really proud of the relationships we have with the places where we are working. And if that isn't your university or your employer, then let HR or student services know about us.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just on a completely frivolous note, it's on the Consent Collective. You've got an amazing clothing store. I've ordered myself a hoodie. I've treated myself.
We love our branding. Our branding's, this work, I think people, at the start, Gabby, you were like, oh, maybe like this is an uncomfortable conversation. You know what the truth is? Yeah. Our work isn't about harm that is caused. Our work is about being that awesome friend who's able to have that conversation with you that you really need. It's about being that manager that can hold something that feels really vulnerable and has gone horribly wrong, but you can hold it in a really skillful way so that, it can be remedied, people can take responsibility, and people can move on if that's appropriate response. Like, this is actually, our work is about human beings at their best. And that's why all of our branding, it means things like hope and being grounded and balanced and all this stuff that we need, courage, because actually us at our best is amazing. And us at our best is the solution to those of us at our worst when they cause harm.
Oh, what a wonderful way to conclude the episode. Thank you so much for your time today and for all the amazing work that you're doing.
Thanks for giving space for a topic area. I know for people like you, it can feel uncomfortable because you can be afraid of asking the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing. But is your audience, what's the gender split of your audience?
It is lion's share female.
Yeah. So the numbers, number of people, your audience who will have lived experience of this will be massive.
That's what I thought, yeah.
Yeah, so I think being able to feel vulnerable and have the conversations, and I think that's really important. So thanks for giving it some space.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Happier Life Project with me, Gabby Sanderson. Now for the important housekeeping. If you are suffering with your mental health, there is a crisis button on the My Possible Self app, which will signpost you to the correct information for immediate expert advice. If you're listening on one of the podcast platforms, the My Possible Self app is completely free to download. You can access all of the content and you don't need to worry about it costing you anything. The views expressed in this podcast are solely those of the interviewer, which is me, and the interviewees. The content of this podcast should not be considered as a substitute for professional or medical advice. The Priory Healthcare are not involved in the production or content of this podcast. If you found this episode helpful and you wouldn't mind sharing or maybe giving us a review, that always goes very much appreciated. And to find and follow us on social media, we are at My Possible Self, and I've been at Radio Gabby. Do take care, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.